Hey guys, Mr. Genuine here, just casually walking down the streets of some European country. Did you guys know I've been to Europe? It's pretty impressive. Anyways, I want to talk to you today about college loans. That's all I got. Let's let's go ahead and get started. What we're talking about today, which is nonviolent resistance. Living as a disciple, lap 2, day 6. Homework. All right, so what is nonviolent resistance? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's confronting violence and injustice with love using only peaceful strategies. So it's resisting, it's protesting in a way that ensures no violence is used. This is not passive acceptance of evil, but it's actively engaging in strategies that promote justice. So it's not just saying, well, we're going to give up, but it's writing petitions and letters. It's making speeches in public places. It's songs and chants that have meaning. It could be a prayer vigil. It could be marches and pilgrimages, walkouts, boycotts, sit-ins, strikes, fasting, etc. So it could be a bunch of people go into a theater for some performance and they all walk out in protest. It could be not buying from a certain store or from a certain store that, promotes something you don't believe in. It could be a bunch of people sitting in a restaurant and refusing to order anything. It could be a group of workers not going to work. It could be public fasting for sometimes days on end. But the idea behind nonviolent resistance is it ends something called the spiral of violence. And this is a concept that our book talks about, where basically they discuss that oftentimes when violence is used, it leads to an escalation. It leads to a ramping up more violence. It leads to retaliation and revenge. And you can see, we're going to talk about examples of this in class, but so often throughout our world, when there's an injustice, it leads to violence, escalating violence. Finally, one side wins, and it doesn't lead to more justice. It leads to injustice, right? The side that wins then takes everything, and the side that loses then faces an injustice, which creates anger, which then will eventually lead to more violence. So Christianity has a long history of nonviolence. Obviously, there are many times throughout the church's history where violence has been used, unfortunately, especially just the Middle Ages were a very violent time in general, and the church succumbed to that worldly violence. But there are countless examples of saints, countless examples of early Christians who were committed to nonviolence, right? Jesus teaches, and this was radical at the time, and it's still radical today. Jesus taught to love and pray for one's enemies. Can you imagine if you actually did that? If the people that upset you and angered you the most in this life, if you took time to pray for them at night, to love them. We have Jesus' own example of nonviolence, who willingly allows himself to be killed, who tells Peter, put that sword away, who doesn't fight, but who preached a message of peace and love that ended up having a far greater impact than if he had used violence to spread his message. And as I mentioned, the example of martyrs, many Christians have renounced violence completely. Right? And this is something that is very countercultural. Even today, I think we think that violence equals strength. And many critics of nonviolence, they argue that violence is necessary and that seeking peace or nonviolent strategies is weak, or it's considered a fantasy. It's not practical. It's not something that will work. It's not something that will achieve a lasting impact. All right, I would like you to read this. I know it's a little bit long, but it's about a pretty recent use of nonviolence in South America. So I would like you to go ahead and read this and be ready to answer a question about it. So again, many critics of nonviolence argue that it's not effective, that it doesn't cause change. But I found this online. It was a study of hundreds of 20th century resistance movements, and it found that nonviolent campaigns are twice as effective as violent movements, twice as effective of reaching their goal, whatever they're protesting, whether it's a government or whether it's getting a law changed. Nonviolent campaigns are twice as effective as violent movements, and that they transition much better to peaceful or democratic governments. So let's say that, there's a dictator in a country and the people rise up. Well, if they rise up with violence, the transition to a peaceful or democratic government is much more difficult. But if they use nonviolent means to, as we just talked about in Guatemala, if they use nonviolent means to promote change, then it's much more likely to transition to a peaceful and democratic government. So why? Why is this? Well, a couple of things. One is that using violence legitimizes government violence, right? If people are being violent, if the citizens are being violent, it looks like the government is justified in then sending out the military to deal with that because they're just trying to keep the peace, quote unquote. They're trying to protect people from the violence of the citizens. But I think the main thing is that it also reduces public support. There are many people who are willing to nonviolently resist, but then once it gets to violence, many people are uncomfortable with that. Think about it. Let's say you wanted to protest the sock rule at Incarnate Word Academy. Now, many of you might be willing on a certain day to wear colorful socks. All of you wear colorful socks together. Many of you might be willing to do that, but if someone said, well, as a means of protest, let's take baseball bats and beat Mr. Johnson's car until all the windows and everything's broken. A lot of you wouldn't be willing to do that, right? It reduces the public support. You don't want to be involved in something like that. It's the same thing with resistance campaigns. And actually, the same study found that nonviolent campaigns are becoming more and more successful. They're becoming more and more successful as we get farther and farther into the current day, into the future. All right, last slide here. So one of the fathers of nonviolence is Gandhi, someone you've probably heard of but don't know a lot about. Since the mid-1800s, India was a colony of England, which means, right, America was a colony of England, which basically means England controlled the government. England used a lot of the Indian resources to better their own empire. And one of the things that the British imposed was something called a salt tax, which when you're in a hot climate like India, salt is very important so that you don't become dehydrated, right? When you sweat, it's not just water that you lose, but it's also salt. So salt was incredibly important to the Indian diet. And there was a lot of natural salt from the Indian Ocean that would wash up on the seas. So it was a very vital resource. And the salt tax forced Indians to buy salt from the British with a heavy tax. So it was a way for them to make more money. So in the 1930s, Gandhi, who lives in India, he leads a march to the sea to harvest salt because, again, a lot of these salt deposits would wash up on the coast of India. And he led a march to the sea to salt. And this caused widespread civil disobedience, people purposely breaking laws, but not in a violent way. So over 60,000 Indians were arrested after this march. Gandhi kind of sparked this movement. And what it did is it led to international attention, right? Because when that many people are being arrested, when that many people are protesting in a nonviolent way, it gets newspaper articles, it spreads awareness of this, it highlighted the injustice, and it undermined the British rule, highlighted how unfair this salt tax was, how unfair this colonial system was, which undermined the British legitimacy to rule, which eventually led to Indian independence from Britain. We'll talk a little bit more about that in class, and we'll see how Gandhi's movement inspired Martin Luther King to actually, how it inspired Martin Luther to use nonviolence in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, and I look forward to discussing this in class.